An interesting thought has come on to recently. This is due to the fact that as we have gotten the Turbo Boost event midway through 11.1.5 and 11.1.7, we also got another round of balance tuning, which is about to go live. Now, while the balance tuning itself has been happening, reasonably often enough, there is another question that players have been posing more and more often, especially to some of the more underperforming or simply underplayed specs right now, which is the difference compared to especially the last expansion, Dragonflight, when it comes to the balance tuning of the specs versus the reworks of the specs. Back in Dragonflight, between the duration of the Dragonflight expansion and the release of the War Within, you had things like the full rework of Rogues happening mid-season, mid-expansion. You had things like the full rework of the 3 Paladin specs happening halfway through Dragonflight. You had a lot of general talent 3s being fully reworked throughout the expansion. Meanwhile, since the War Within launched, we have gotten the latest one was the generic talent 3 of Druids to be reworked. This was basically the last one of the class talent 3 left from being reworked, as well as prior to them you had the Shaman one, their general talent 3 being changed in Season 1. And as far as specific spec reworks go, then we had the Undermined patch, the Season 2 patch rework of Marksmanship Hunter, which even with the rework didn't really actually change much of how marksmanship plays anyways. So the question is, compared to Dragonflight, where have all of the reworks gone? All of the turning an entire spec upside down compared to what we have used to see now in Dragonflight. Now, we might have already have the answer. Honestly, this video is about to be very short if the answer very simply is, well, now we have hero talents. A lot of the attention, a lot of the development time of Blizzard didn't really go into the big picture of the talent tree, but rather on the smaller picture of the hero talents. Because if we have seen some major overhauls of talents, it was basically hero talents. You have gotten the mage hero talents, especially Spellslinger and Sun Fury being changed multiple times. You had just recently the full rework of a couple of the hero talents of Hunter, Dark Ranger and Pack Leader. Early on in the expansion you had the one changing the Warlock hero talents, especially Hellcaller and Diabolist. So if anything more so than quick and often happening balance tuning, we had more often and changing hero talents tuning. However, this still left behind the excitement, the notion of reading some Blizzard Blue post pointing out that, for example, for 11.1.7 or 0.5, we were going to get a full overhaul of the talents of Warriors, for example, or of all of the talents of Druids, for example, which is the exact same thing we had the last expansion. 0.5 or 0.7 patches bringing you the overhaul to Rogues or the overhaul to Paladins. Something that we haven't gotten in this expansion. While the balancing of specs can be close to being very good or very even, it's not that this season, for example, in the raid, there is a massive imbalance of specs with some very clear super performers, 10-15% even DPS ahead of others, for example. If you look at the raid right now, for example, the bottom performance, their average DPS is 2.5 million DPS, whereas the currently best overall performer, Devastation Evoker, is averaging 2.717 million DPS. So about 220k more DPS than the bottom, which is about like an 8% damage increase from top to bottom of the raid results. So while the balancing actually might be, or definitely is, slightly better, even more close to each other in this season, and the healer balancing is even closer, healers now are quite close to each other, there is still the question of reworks, the question of certain specs, even if their performance is okay. Many players have not been very satisfied by the way the spec plays, by the way the talents have been not changing for quite a while. For example, specs like Subtlety Rogue, specs like Shadow Priest, specs like BM Hunter, or problems about target capping, limiting certain AoE options, for example, of warrior specs in Mythic Plus. We have been missing, this excitement of checking out the PTR in the new build, to see all of the changes about to come for a new spec, to see how could the spec change, whether or not hopefully the changes for the specs were going to be positive or negative, which is something we had in Dragonflight and we are missing now. If you compare the differences, it's quite a leap. In Dragonflight we went from having 3 new specs being released, 2 at the beginning and then augmentation later on, plus multiple reworks of multiple specs. Meanwhile, this expansion we got no new specs and no new class, of course, and also basically no proper reworks to any of the specs. So it is a wonder if we had to find the fault, if we had to point the finger at someone, it might have to be the hero talents, taking away development time from Blizzard, now being busy balancing not just the talents, not just your normal talent tree, but also your hero talent trees. If that might have been the cause of fewer amount of large scale reworks to multiple specs. Different players might find problems, they might like a full rework for different reasons. For example, Brewmaster has not been a viable, end game Mythic Plus tank because of their stagger mechanic for a long time, so maybe it's time to come up with a rework for the spec. What about Guardian Druid, who has not really been working as a tank for a long time? What about reworking them? Priests, right? How often are we gonna have Holy Priests being so weak in Mythic Plus ever since Shadowlands? How about, and this might be a bit too early because they were reworked last expansion, but their constant debate between having half of your talents being for melee healing, half of your talents being for straight up caster is not working. How about we just give up on one of the two, and when we say one of the two is the caster version, and just go full melee healer in a rework? Rogues have been lamenting problems in their rotation very often, especially Outlaw and Sub, despite also being specs reworked in Dragonflight. So there is this question in this expansion, something that stands out compared to Dragonflight. While we might praise that in the end, actually, numbers at hand, the balancing is better, especially in the raid, the power level of the specs is not nearly as OP as it was, or drastically larger in terms of power from the top to the bottom as it was before, but we have lost this, this excitement mid-season, also to keep things new, to keep things fresh in between the excitement of a new patch, right? When you feel like you have nothing to do on month 3 or month 4 of a patch. Back then, last expansion, we had full reworks. Yes, you might say, not for the better, since the additions in the last expansion were the mid-season release of Augmentation, as well as the mid-season release of the Holy Paladin rework. Those gave us this, which is not a very fond memory for pretty much any other one of the 5 specs not included in this picture. But besides this unfortunate rework, it's a peculiar thing that we have been missing this in this expansion, something extra to throw at us in these 0.5 and 0.7 patches in between the big ones. Balance tuning by itself is okay, but honestly, when has balance tuning been enough to drastically change the course of a season, right? True. A few weeks ago, with enough nerfs to fire and enough buffs to arcane, you had a swap in Mythic Plus, going from Fire Mage to Arcane Mage. That was a thing. We can say in Season 1, possibly in between the nerfs to Resto Shaman, the very small nerf to Resto Shaman, where more players went over playing Discipline instead of Resto Shaman. That's another one. But for the most part, the damage changes will be a 4 or 5% buff or a 4 or 5% nerf. It's not that they will be giving you new talents, move your talent tree around, or significantly change the way you play anyways, which is something that usually happens because of a rework, a major rework, a massive rework of your talents, which we have been missing in this expansion. As I said, we're not quite sure if we have to fully point the finger at the hero talents, draining away development time from having time for reworks. Either way, it is something missing. It is something we wish it was back in this expansion. And again, even better if it is halfway through the patches. If it comes, for example, in 11.2? Well, in 11.2 it would have less of an impact. The reason why it would have less of an impact is because 11.2 by itself is already a major patch. 11.2 will give you new Mythic Plus season, new raid, new 30 item levels to farm. Usually in between major patches there is going to be a large amount of balance tuning anyways, a large amount of buffs or a large amount of nerfs anyways that can drastically change the meta, right? So we had no need for major reworks between Season 1 and Season 2 of this expansion to see, for example, Augmentation no longer be meta from Season 1 to Season 2, Enhancement Shaman no longer be meta from Season 1 to Season 2, and Frost Decay no longer be meta from Season 1 to Season 2, as well as Prot Paladin. The only thing that happened is that they were nerfed, and other specs were buffed. So you had no need to add a rework, a full spec rework for all of these changes to happen, because it was a major patch. Where it gets spicier is when the rework happens in between patches, in minor patches like 0.5 or 1.5 or 2.5 or 0.7, where the season has been out for 2 or 3 months, the meta has stabilized, it has starting to get a bit stale, a bit repetitive in what you see being played all the time, and then bam, comes a major rework of a couple of specs or an entire class, for example. That is also something that can make up things a bit more spicy, a bit more entertaining mid-season, when usually things tend to start getting a bit more boring. And it was the point of this video, was that it was a bit curious that we have been lacking these kind of rework compared to the last expansion. So we have been left wondering, and we're still left wondering without an answer, where have these reworks gone? Who took them? Who took the development time of these reworks for them not to be here in this expansion and this season in particular? With this very difficult to answer question, we are done for today on this Tuesday, still wishing that some of these will come out. Well, at this point in 11.1.7 there is really no hope, as we would have heard something from the PTR, from the notes of the PTR, that Blizzard was planning any kind of major changes to the specs, and we have nothing so far, so we likely won't have any in 11.1.7. Maybe by 11.2 being released, we will hear something in the notes of 11.2 that some specs are planned to get reworks later on in the patch. Maybe in the next season, but it's definitely still a few months away at this point. With this question mark about the situation related to reworks established, it is now time to leave each other on this Tuesday. So we're starting our goodbyes, of course, by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, the classic, the dog barking symphony outside, and as soon as you close the window, everyone goes silent.